The morning the auction house at Ridgeline Flats recorded its highest single-day gross in 11 years, Clara Voss stood at the center of the gravel lot, with her arms loose at her sides and her boots already dusty at 7 in the morning, and the man beside the podium, Holt Decker, who ran the regional livestock brokerage, and whose voice carried the particular warmth of someone who has already calculated what he intends to take from you, looked at her the way a cat looks at a door it has decided to wait out. He was smiling. His smile had not changed in shape since she had walked through that gate, but something behind it had gone tight, the way a rope goes tight before it snaps, because the number chalked on the board above Clara's pen was not the number he had told his buyers to expect, and the buyers who had arrived from 3 counties over to scoop up what they assumed would be bargain stock were standing very still and doing their own arithmetic, and none of it was working out the way Holt Decker had promised them it would. Clara looked at the board. She looked at the horses behind the rail. She did not look at Holt Decker, and that stillness of hers, that refusal to give him the dignity of her gaze, was the only reply she needed to make. 3 years earlier, almost to the week, every person in that same gravel lot had watched her buy 24 horses nobody wanted and called her the saddest kind of fool there is, the kind who doesn't know enough to be embarrassed. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. By the way, wherever in the world you're watching from right now, let me know in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories reach. Okay, where were we? Yes. A bitterly cold February morning, the kind that comes down off the high desert like a personal insult, the kind where even the ravens hunker and say nothing. It was the first week of February, and the ground at the Bureau of Land Management holding facility outside Ridgeline Flats had been frozen solid for 19 days. Clara Voss had driven 90 minutes in the dark to be there before the pens opened, and she had brought with her a thermos of black coffee, a folded piece of paper with 72 hours of calculations on it, and no company, because company in those days was not something she had in surplus. Her husband Leland had died 14 months before, a sudden cardiac event, the kind the doctors describe with clinical brevity that doesn't account for the hole it leaves in the geometry of a life. And the 240 acres they had worked together out on the Vermilion draw had since that day been operated by Clara alone, or near enough to alone that the difference was a formality. She was 51 years old. Her hair had gone the color of iron sometime in her 40s, and she had not worried about it, because Leland had called it distinguished, and she had decided to take him at his word. She had 12 horses already on the draw, a mix of quarter horses and 1 Appaloosa mare that had belonged to Leland's mother, and she had $308 in the account she kept separate from the land expenses, which was the account she thought of as the room-to-breathe account. And that morning the room-to-breathe was not particularly spacious. The BLM sale was one of the regular efforts to thin the gathered herds. Mustangs collected from overpopulated ranges across the high plateau, animals that federal rangers had spent months sorting, penning, and in some cases barely gentling. The agency needed them gone. The holding cost per animal was somewhere around $5 a day, and a facility full of unclaimed horses was an expense with no return, and so the sale prices reflected institutional desperation more than any fair reckoning of what an animal was worth. Clara walked the pens for 2 hours before the bidding opened. She walked them slowly, the way she had always walked anything she was thinking seriously about, with her hands in her coat pockets and her eyes doing the work her mouth kept quiet about. Most of the buyers that day were not interested in wild horses at all. They were there for 2 lots of weaned quarter-horse colts that a ranch north of the facility had offloaded, good straight legs and already halter broke, the kind of animals that practically sell themselves. The Mustangs, penned separately along the east fence, were the afterthought of the afterthought. 24 of them. The facility had grouped them together out of what amounted to procedural convenience, They were all from the same mesa range, all caught in the same roundup 6 months prior, and none had found adopters through the standard program. They were rough-looking. The word most of the buyers used, when they paused to look at all, was scrubby. One man in a good hat said they looked like the idea of horses rather than actual horses. He meant it as a dismissal, but Clara filed it away as an observation she found interesting, because the idea of a horse that had survived on a mesa at 6,000 feet elevation through 2 consecutive drought years and a hard winter was an idea she found genuinely compelling. She stood at the east pen rail for a long time. She watched how the horses moved inside the confinement, which was not the same as watching the confinement itself. Some animals pace when they are penned, some go dull. These 24 moved in the contained way of things that have learned to conserve, short, deliberate, reading the air at the fence line with their noses and their ears without wasting energy on noise. They were smaller than a buyer looking for arena performance would want. Their hooves were in remarkable condition for animals that had never seen a farrier, shaped by the volcanic rock of the mesa the way a whetstone shapes a blade, close and hard and dense. Their coats were not groomed, obviously, but under the rough surface, Clara could see the kind of body condition you only get from real work. Not feedlot fat, not show barn polished, but the lean, fibrous hardiness that comes from covering ground to find water when water is thin on the ground. She recognized it the way you recognize something you have read about but never expected to see with your own eyes. She counted them. She counted them again. She unfolded her paper and did arithmetic in the margin with a stub of pencil, and when she folded the paper back up and put it in her pocket, she had made her decision. She bought all 24 for a total of $3,360, an average of $140 per animal, which checks out across all 24, which was what the BLM needed to clear them off the books, and which was, by the reckoning of every other buyer in the lot that morning, approximately $140 more than any rational person would pay for a single one of them. There was laughter. Not the theatrical kind, not the mean-spirited performance of cruelty, but the easy, bewildered laughter of people who genuinely could not understand what they were seeing and had defaulted to amusement as a coping mechanism. One woman who ran a boarding operation near the highway said, not quietly enough, that she supposed everyone had a right to make their own mistakes. A man named Garrett, who had bought cattle at Ridgeline for 30 years, shook his head and told the man beside him that the Voss widow had clearly taken leave of her senses. Holt Decker, who was not yet the antagonist of this story, but was already auditioning for the role, walked up to Clara after the paperwork was signed and put a hand on the rail beside her and said he had to admire her spirit, if not her judgment, and that if she found herself in a bind over the next few months, she should feel free to call him, because he bought horses too, bought them cheap, and he could probably help her out of whatever situation she was fixing to create for herself. Clara thanked him for the thought and said she would keep it in mind, and she said it the way a person says a thing they have no intention of ever doing. The hauling took 2 trips. The trailer was her own, a 6-horse slant load she had paid off over 4 years of Leland's careful monthly accounting, and by the time the last load made it down the Vermilion Draw Road and through the gate she had left propped open, it was past 3 in the afternoon, and the light was coming off the sandstone in long amber sheets, and the temperature was dropping again toward something genuinely dangerous. She had already arranged the pastures, the South 40, which was the biggest unfenced section and the one with the least to damage, had been sectioned with temporary panel fencing she had spent the previous 2 weekends setting up, working alone, driving posts in frozen earth with a rented hydraulic driver, pulling wire by hand when the post driver couldn't reach the corners. 24 animals in the South 40, room enough to move, shelter from the worst of the north wind in a shallow arroyo that ran along the west fence line, water from the stock tank that fed off the windmill. She had checked the windmill 3 times in January. Her nearest neighbor, a man named Agustin Ferreira, who had come to the high desert from southern Portugal 40 years before, and had never quite adopted the habit of speaking more words than were strictly necessary, watched her unload the second trailer from across the fence line. He was 68 years old, or said he was, and had the kind of weathered stillness that suggested age had simply compressed him into something denser rather than diminished him. He grew dry land specialty peppers on his 30 acres, varieties that people in the valley thought were an eccentric hobby until they started appearing in restaurant supply catalogs from Santa Fe. And he had a particular genius for seeing what a plant would become before it showed any sign of becoming it. He watched the horses come off the trailer in the cold amber light, and he was quiet for a long time after they were all in the South 40 and Clara had latched the gate and was coiling the lead rope she had used for the last two. Then he said, in the accented plainness that was his only register, "A broken seed sprouts deepest." That was all. Clara looked at him. He nodded once and went back to his side of the fence. She repeated the words under her breath on the walk to the house, not because she needed to memorize them, but because they felt like something she wanted to carry in her mouth a while before she put them down. A broken seed sprouts deepest. She would think of those words many times in the months that followed, when the work was hard enough that thinking anything at all felt like a luxury. Spring that year came late and mean. March on the high desert has no sympathy for plans, and the plans Clara had made for beginning the slow work of gentling the 24 were pushed back by 6 weeks of weather that alternated between freezing rain and wind that drove grit into every surface and every gap. She ran her existing 12 horses as she always had, keeping their routine steady, and she checked on the South 40 twice a day and sometimes a third time at dusk, because she was not yet certain enough of what she had to leave it unattended in the dark. The Mustangs had sorted themselves with an efficiency that was quietly impressive. They had identified the shelter of the arroyo without being shown it. They had established a hierarchy. She watched it happen over the first 2 weeks, the small adjustments and repositionings that left one compact dark bay mare with a chevron blaze as the acknowledged center of the group's attention. Clara named her privately in her own mind, not yet aloud. She called her Cardinal in her head for the way she carried authority without display, and she noted in a small spiral notebook the name she was silently assigning, not because she intended to saddle all 24 or turn them into show animals, but because observation is easier when things have names, and she was a very careful observer. It was in April that she found the girl. Found is perhaps the wrong word. Encountered is better, or recognized, in the sense of recognizing something you were not expecting, but somehow knew. The child was 9 years old. Her name was Petra, and she lived 2 miles up the draw road in a house that belonged to her grandmother, who was often not well enough to watch her with any particular attention, and Petra had the habit of going where she felt inclined on days when attention was not being paid. She appeared one morning at the South 40 fence, a small child in a coat that was too thin for the temperature, watching the horses with an expression of absolute absorption that Clara recognized because she had worn the same expression herself at the rail of the BLM facility. Clara brought her a warmer jacket from the mudroom and a cup of hot cocoa, and said nothing about the trespassing, because it did not seem to her like trespassing. It seemed like recognizing something valuable. Petra had already named Cardinal, had given her the same name, Cardinal, which Clara took as a small, unscientific confirmation of something she could not have argued into being. The child came back the next day, and the day after. Within 3 weeks, she was there most mornings before school, doing what Clara told her to do, which was mostly to stand at the fence and be still and let the horses decide how close was close. Petra was exceptional at stillness. It was the kind of stillness that only certain children have, not the stillness of suppression, but the stillness of deep interest, the body going quiet so the mind can reach further. Clara put her to work in gradual, careful increments, carrying the water buckets when Clara carried water, moving along the fence line on a set pattern so the horses learned her shape, eventually sitting on the top rail and doing nothing but existing at the same elevation as their backs. It was the kind of patient education that takes longer than any restless person can tolerate, and Petra tolerated it magnificently. The actual gentling work, the slow, unglamorous daily labor of convincing a wild horse that a human being is not a predator, began in earnest in late April, when the weather broke enough to make the South 40 workable in the early morning hours. Clara started with the 3 animals she had assessed as most likely to find the transition manageable. Not the boldest, not the most aggressive, but the ones with the quality she thought of as ready curiosity, the ones that had begun moving toward the fence when she approached rather than away from it. She worked one at a time inside a 50-foot round pen she had assembled from panels along the south fence, spending 40 minutes each morning doing nothing more dramatic than moving in the pen with the horse, reading the angle of the ears, the weight shift, the breathing, making herself a predictable and eventually boring presence rather than a threat. This is the arithmetic of trust. You give more than you take nothing before it is offered, and you keep the ledger clear. She kept notes in the spiral book: date, animal, duration, what happened, what she would try next. 14 pages in the first 3 weeks. The costs were running through her head constantly. The hay she was supplementing the grazing with, $320 in April, $340 in May, because the spring grass was slower than she had hoped. The veterinary check she had scheduled for the first week of May to assess the whole group for the parasites and nutritional deficiencies that often came with range collection, which would run just under $400 for a basic pass on 24 animals, the farrier consultation she was putting off because the feet, frankly, were still in better condition than any domestic horse she had seen, and she did not want to interfere with what the mesa had made. The $308 in the room to breathe account was gone before April was half done. She sold 2 of the yearling quarter horses she had bred herself to cover the gap, which was a transaction that cost her more in future potential than in present feeling. But the arithmetic was the arithmetic, and she was not in the business of pretending otherwise. By the 1st of June, 11 of the 24 had accepted a halter. By the 1st of July, 18 had. By late August, all 24 would stand for haltering, lead at a walk, and pick up their feet on a light request, which for animals that had been completely wild 6 months before was a pace of progress that Clara did not announce and did not advertise, because she had learned early that in the arithmetic of scorn it is easier for people to believe a thing is still rotten than to admit they were wrong to mock it, and she had no interest in inviting the mockery back before she was ready to answer it conclusively. She kept the South 40 private. The panel fencing along the roadside was supplemented with a shade cloth windscreen that she told anyone who asked, which was almost no one, was to cut the afternoon sun for the horses. The horses did not need the shade cloth. The cloth was there so passing trucks could not count heads. Holt Decker had a tendency to drive the draw road on his way to his other holdings further up the valley, and Clara had noticed the noticing way he slowed down near her gate. She had her first real conversation with Decker in July at the post office in Ridgeline, which was the kind of small-town commerce nexus where chance encounters were rarely entirely chance. He told her he had been thinking about her since February, thinking with genuine concern, he said, that she might be finding the winter difficult on her own, and that if she was finding herself stretched thin, which he imagined she must be, given the additional mouths she had purchased in February, he would be willing to take some of that weight off her hands. He knew a man who would come out and make her a fair offer, he said. Clara looked at him for a moment with the particular quality of attention that was her version of pity. She said she was managing fine, thank you, and bought her stamps and left. Holt Decker watched her go and said nothing, which was his version of patience. And patience in a man like Decker was simply greed with good posture. Augustine Ferreira, who had watched the progress across the fence line with quiet appreciation through the summer, told Clara in September that the horses moved like water, which was his way of saying they were beautiful, and he said it with the same brevity and certainty with which he had said everything else. He also said, over the fence one evening, when the light was the color of old copper, and Cardinal had come to stand near the corner of the South 40, closest to where they talked, "The worth of a thing is not in its beginning, it is in what it decides to become." This was not the same aphorism as the first, but it was related, and Clara understood that he was giving her two halves of the same idea, the way you give someone the top and bottom of a letter separately when you want to be sure they read it twice. She repeated it to Petra the next morning, and Petra said, with the directness of 9-year-old minds that have not yet learned to soften certainty, "That's what Cardinal did." Clara agreed that it was. The fall of that year passed in the particular rhythm of high desert autumn, the shortening days coming down in clean gold angles across the draw, the cottonwoods along the creek bed going yellow in the first week of October, and then, bare by the end of it, the temperature dropping in the nights with a sharpness that smelled of pine and cold stone. Clara had begun working 5 of the 24 under saddle. Nothing ambitious, nothing rushed, just the fundamental conversation between a horse's back and a rider's weight, establishing trust in that direction too. She was riding Cardinal herself. The mare had turned out to be exactly the horse Clara had suspected she was from across the pen in the BLM facility, attentive, responsive, possessed of a particular intelligence that expressed itself as an endless interest in solving the problem being offered rather than resisting it. Cardinal learned things in half the repetitions a conventionally trained horse would need. She learned them and remembered them without revision, which is rarer than most people realize. Clara did not enter her anywhere. She did not show her to anyone who hadn't already seen her. She continued making notes in the spiral book, which was now the second spiral book, because the first was full, and she had dated and filed the first one in the tin box on the shelf in the mudroom, where she kept the documents that mattered. November brought the news that changed everything, though at first it did not look like news at all. It looked like the kind of local environmental report that people mention at feed stores and then forget. A hydrological survey commissioned by the county had identified a significant aquifer running beneath the high Mesa Plateau, including beneath the exact range from which Clara's 24 horses had been gathered. The aquifer was extensive. The survey report, which Clara obtained and read completely, described it as a Jurassic-era sandstone formation with a recharge rate that made it one of the larger undocumented water reserves in the state. The mesa, which had been considered marginal grazing land, and worse, essentially worthless as a water source, was sitting on top of more clean water than the valley had seen in recorded history. The county was already in preliminary talks with the state water authority. The land above the aquifer, much of which was federal grazing lease land that had been available for private permit purchase for years without generating interest, suddenly acquired a value that no one had anticipated and many people could not immediately calculate. Clara sat with the survey report for 3 evenings in a row, reading it at the kitchen table, with the wood stove going and the second spiral notebook open beside it. Then she called the county planning office and asked several careful questions, and then she called a water rights attorney in the city, and then she sat for a 4th evening and did arithmetic on a fresh piece of paper for a long time. She had not purchased the Mesa land, of course. What she had done was purchase the horses that everyone else had dismissed as an unwanted byproduct of that land. The living proof that the range could sustain a breeding population of horses on its native forage and water through consecutive drought years, which the survey now explained completely. The horses had been drinking from seeps and fracture springs fed by the aquifer, surface expressions so subtle that the range survey teams had classified them as seasonal wet spots and paid them no particular attention. Clara's 24 horses were the evidence of water. They were the argument made in flesh and bone and hard hooves that the mesa's apparent worthlessness was a failure of observation, not a fact of geology. And Clara, who had spent 14 months watching the arithmetic of scorn work its ordinary damage, who had bought the evidence for $3,360 while people laughed, now sat in her kitchen and understood that she was holding something. The county and the water authority and the land permit office were going to want to talk to her about very soon. She did not make any calls that week. She finished the evening with the stove and the notebook, and she thought about Leland, the way he had of laying out a decision on the table the way you lay out a hand of cards, looking at it from every angle before touching anything. She thought about Augustine's words, "A broken seed sprouts deepest. The worth of a thing is not in its beginning, it is in what it decides to become." She thought about Petra, who had sat on a fence rail in a thin coat in April and looked at wild horses with the face of someone recognizing a future. Word travels in small places, the way water travels through rock, slowly, invisibly, and then all at once. By December, Ridgeline Flats knew about the aquifer. By January, the people who had been leasing grazing rights on the Mesa Plateau land for nominal fees were suddenly consulting attorneys of their own, and the people who had let their permits lapse because the land seemed worthless were experiencing the specific misery of being wrong about something in public. Holt Decker had not let his permits lapse. This was the first thing Clara noted when the county planning records, which were public and which Clara had looked at in November, showed that Decker held active grazing leases on 3 sections of the Mesa Plateau, sections that sat at the western edge of the mapped aquifer formation. The second thing she noted was that his leases were up for renewal in March, which was 2 months away, and that the State Water Authority had issued a preliminary advisory suggesting that surface land use on the aquifer overlay zone would require coordinated management, which was regulatory language for the fact that whoever held those leases had both value and responsibility in equal measure. Holt Decker came to the draw in January. He drove his truck in through the open gate without calling ahead, which was either an oversight or a statement, and he parked in front of the house and came to the door in the kind of mood that men who are accustomed to setting the terms wear when they feel the terms shifting. Clara put on her coat and came out to him, rather than inviting him in, because the house was her interior and she preferred this conversation outdoors. He was pleasant. He was very pleasant. The pleasantness of a man organizing a retreat who does not want to call it a retreat. He said he had been watching her operation with real admiration. He said the horses had turned out to be something of a surprise, and he had to hand it to her. She had seen something he and the others had missed. He said he thought there might be an opportunity here for a business arrangement that would benefit them both. He was thinking, he said, of a figure. And here he named a number for Clara's 24 horses as a unit, for the value they now represented as documented evidence of the aquifer's surface hydrology, and the figure he named was $12,000. He said it with the confidence of a man who has calculated the minimum he can offer without it looking like an insult. Clara looked at him, not with anger, with the flat, clear attention that had always been her version of answer. She said, $12,000. He said yes. He thought that was fair, given the uncertainty still involved. She said, for all 24. He said that was right. She said, you counted them, not a question. He heard it land, and she watched the surface of his pleasantness develop a small crack, because the only way Holt Decker knew her count was if he had been inside the South 40 or had had someone inside it, which was not an invited visit, and he had just told her he knew her exact number by saying yes without hesitating to 24. He heard the crack too. He adjusted. He said he had made an estimate based on but she had already stopped listening to the explanation, because the explanation was not the point. The point was that he had just handed her the rope. What she chose to do with it was the only question remaining. She thanked him for coming out, and she said she would think about his offer. And she said it the way you say a thing that both parties understand means something else entirely, and she went back inside. The auction at Ridgeline Flats in February was not precisely a horse auction. It was a coordinated public sale organized with the County Water Authority and two ranching cooperatives from the Mesa region, structured around the question of who would manage the Mesa grazing leases going forward and under what terms, with the hydrology documentation, including the evidence of the horses, as part of the formal record. Clara had spent 6 weeks consulting with the water attorney, with a range ecologist who drove up from the university to look at the South 40 and spend 3 days making notes of his own, and with 3 of the neighboring ranchers who had lost their Mesa lease options and were now looking for a way into a cooperative arrangement that would let them participate in whatever the aquifer's management was going to require. She had also had a conversation with Garrett, the man who had shaken his head at her in February 3 years before, in which Garrett had said simply, "You were right, and I was a damn fool to laugh, and what would you suggest we do now?" Clara had appreciated this more than she showed. Garrett was a man who could say he was wrong without needing it to cost the other person anything, which was a quality rarer than good water and worth more than people accounted for. The morning of the February auction was that cold, gritty, dust-sharpened morning already described, the one where Holt Decker's smile had gone tight, and the buyers from 3 counties over were doing arithmetic that would not resolve in his favor. The horses were not the auction lot, the horses were the evidence. They stood in a temporary pen to one side of the gravel lot, 24 of them, cardinal at the center of the group's attention, as she always was, their winter coats full and thick, their hard mesa hooves planted on the gravel with a steadiness that was its own kind of testimony. The range ecologist had submitted a formal assessment. The water attorney had submitted the hydrology cross-reference. The county planning board had posted the public notice as required. Holt Decker was present with his own attorney, and with the 3 buyers he had clearly arranged to bid on the cooperative lease structure he had spent the preceding weeks quietly assembling, a structure that would have effectively given him controlling interest in the aquifer surface management by aggregating the lease rights of the partners he had recruited by telling them Clara was informed by Garrett numbers about the anticipated water revenue that he had arrived at through what seemed to be an arithmetic of invention rather than calculation. When Clara stood at the podium and presented the cooperative management proposal that she and the 3 neighboring ranchers had formalized with the county, she stated the terms plainly. The lease coordination would be managed by a cooperative board, membership open to all existing and lapsed permit holders at equal share. The horses, her 24 horses, would remain on the draw as the working demonstration herd for the Mesa Ecosystem Study, which the university had agreed to fund in partnership with the County Water Authority for an initial period of 5 years. The value of each cooperative share was calculated from the Water Authority's preliminary revenue projection divided by the number of member ranches, and the number she stated, $4,200 per share, or roughly 10 times what Holt Decker had offered her for all 24 horses combined, was the arithmetic of what the thing had actually been worth all along, as opposed to the arithmetic of what a man with controlling ambitions had needed her not to know. Holt Decker said across the gravel lot that she was overreaching. He said it with the controlled temper of a man who has only one move left and knows it. He said the legal structure was untested and the water projections were speculative, and he had buyers here who were prepared to offer real money for real rights. And perhaps everyone would be better served by letting the market determine value, which was his familiar language for letting him set the price. Clara looked at him for the first and only time that morning. She said, "The market determined value in February 3 years ago, It said $140. The market was wrong. She said it without heat, without satisfaction, with the level certainty of a person stating a fact they have had sufficient time to confirm. Then she said, "Every ranch in this county that wants a share of the cooperative is welcome to one. Same price for everyone. That includes yours, Holt, if you want it on those terms." He said nothing. She took his silence as a vote in favor of accurate arithmetic and moved on. She invited Garrett first. He said yes immediately and signed where indicated. Two women who ran a sheep operation on the north end of the valley came forward together and signed as one unit, which the cooperative structure permitted. A younger rancher named Soledad, who had inherited her grandfather's lease and been quietly horrified to discover it had lapsed before the Aquifer news, said she could not afford the $4,000 and change right now. And Clara said, "I know, and the board has agreed to a deferred entry provision for hardship cases. Terms are in the second page. Take it home and read it." Soledad read it that afternoon and signed it the next morning. Even three of the buyers Decker had brought from out of county, seeing which way the arithmetic was running, separated quietly from his orbit and asked about membership terms. And Clara gave them the same answer she had given everyone else, because the cooperative's purpose was abundance, not revenge. Holt Decker did not sign that day. He went home and spent, Clara was told by someone who knew his attorney, approximately 3 weeks being angry and approximately 2 days being practical. And then his attorney called her attorney and said that his client would like to take the cooperative share. And her attorney said the offer was still open on the same terms as it had been for everyone else. And Decker signed, and if he felt the particular discomfort of a man who has been generous when he expected to be punished, he did not say so, and Clara did not comment on it. The university's range ecologist published his assessment of the demonstration herd in the following spring. He described them in the formal language of academic documentation as an unusually resilient and genetically diverse sample population exhibiting phenotypic characteristics consistent with long-term adaptation to arid high-altitude conditions, including enhanced hoof density, efficient water metabolism, and notable calm under novel stimulus, the last of which he attributed partly to the gentling work Clara had done, which he described in the paper's methodology section, with a careful respect for what patient human labor achieves that academic papers do not always manage. Cardinal was photographed for the paper. The photograph showed her standing at the fence line of the South 40, with her head up and her ears forward, looking at something beyond the camera, with the exact expression of intelligent attention that Clara had first noticed across the BLM facility rail in that gray February cold, 3 years and $3,360 ago. Augustine Ferreira saw the paper when Clara showed it to him across the fence line in late April, the cottonwoods barely in bud, the mesa visible on the horizon in the clear morning air with its long, flat profile that had always looked, to Clara, less like a landform and more like a decision. He looked at the photograph of Cardinal for a moment and handed the paper back. He said, she knew where the water was. He meant the horse. He probably also meant Clara. He went back to his peppers. Petra, who was now 11 years old and who had graduated from fence rail stillness to riding Cardinal on a loose rein through the South 40 with a naturalness that Clara watched with genuine pleasure, was present at this exchange. She said, "Is that true? Did she know?" Clara said she didn't know if the horses knew in any conscious sense, but she thought that things adapted to survive in a place carry the knowledge of that place in their bodies, even if they can't name it. And Petra considered this for a moment, and then said, "So the water was always there, and we just had to believe the horses." Clara said, "Yes, that is exactly what it was." The cooperative managed its first full year of coordinated lease operations the following winter and returned a modest surplus to its members, modest enough that no one grew reckless about it, substantial enough that no one questioned the terms. The mesa had not become something it was not. It had become, with the aquifer study underway and the grazing coordinated carefully, something closer to what it had always been trying to be. A landscape able to sustain the things adapted to it, without being demanded to perform beyond its nature. This seemed right to Clara. She thought about Leland, who had been a practical man with a feeling for what a piece of land was saying if you went quiet enough to hear it. She thought he would have liked the cooperative, and would have liked Garrett and Soledad, and would have told the whole story at a very reasonable pace over a very long dinner, and probably made everyone laugh at the part with Holt Decker's smile going tight. One evening in late November of that second year, Clara walked the South 40 at dusk, which she still did every evening, not because she needed to check the fence or verify the water, but because the habit of that walk had become the rhythm by which she understood what a day had been. The 24 horses moved around her in the dimming light, their winter coats full again, their breath making small separate clouds in the cold air. Cardinal walked with her for a portion of the circuit, not following exactly, but paralleling, close enough to be companionship. The mesa was a dark line against a sky going purple, and then deeper blue, and somewhere under it the water moved through old stone at its own unhurried geologic pace, indifferent to what anyone above it thought about value. A broken seed sprouts deepest. The worth of a thing is not in its beginning, it is in what it decides to become. Clara said both of these aloud to Cardinal, who flicked one ear and kept walking, which was as much confirmation as Clara required. She thought about the spiral notebooks, 3 of them now, the third nearly full, and about the tin box in the mudroom, and about the folded piece of paper she had carried to the BLM facility on a frozen morning with 72 hours of calculations in the margin, and about how the calculation she had not written down on that paper, the one she had carried in a different kind of ledger entirely, had turned out to be the one that mattered. She thought about the fact that one person alone, which is how Ridgeline had seen her, and how she had sometimes seen herself, is not a verdict. It is a beginning. And about the fact that being right is its own kind of reply, and that silence had always unnerved the confident more than argument, and that the horses had known this all along in their bones and their hard feet and their patient, desert-calibrated stillness. Petra came through the gate in the last of the light, her grandmother knowing now to expect her here and finding it a better arrangement than most. And she came up beside Clara and did not say anything for a while, which was still one of her best qualities. Then she said, "Augustine says next year his peppers will need water from the cooperative." Clara said, "That's what it's there for." Petra said, "He also said," and she got the cadence right, the accented plainness, the way of fitting a large thought into a small number of words. "He said that the accounts of a life are never finished while there is still land and work and someone willing to count honestly." Clara looked at her. Petra shrugged with the small precision of a child delivering a message she knows is important and trusts the recipient to understand. Cardinal came to the fence rail near where they stood, and stood there, breathing, her blaze a pale mark in the gathering dark, counting nothing and knowing everything, the way an animal does when it has survived the world long enough to simply inhabit it. Clara put her hand on the rail beside the horse's shoulder, not quite touching, and the 3 of them, woman, child, horse, stayed like that in the cold and the quiet until the stars came out above the mesa and the water went on running deep and dark and patient under everything, as it had for 10,000 years before anyone thought to look for it, and as it would for 10,000 more.